evening, and welcome to Space Place Canada's second event. My name is Kirsten Vanstone, and I'm a Space Place director and a planetarium enthusiast. If you were at our evening with Bob McDonald last January in the before times, thank you for joining us again. It has taken us a little bit of time to regroup and plan online events, but we're delighted to gather again, even if it is only in 2 dimensions. Though we're stuck at opposite ends of a YouTube feed, please interact with us tonight. If you have logged into YouTube, you can use the comments to make comments or to ask questions. I can see them here in our broadcast studio and can pass them along to our speaker. You can also reach us on Twitter at SpacePlaceCDA. I'll put that in the comments later. And you can ask comments and questions there. And you can also even ask questions via email. Our chair, Henry Lowton, is actually monitoring his chair at spaceplacecanada.ca email address tonight. Again, I'll put all these in the comments for you. We may ask you some questions too. In fact, you can use the comments to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, why you're interested in this project. Of course, to answer that, you might want to know what our project is. Space Place Planetarium Canada is a not-for-profit corporation. We are made up of professionals from across Canada, and our leadership team is drawn from many astronomy and science advocacy organizations. Our goal, ultimately, is to bring a 21st century planetarium to Toronto, and we're building support for this project through a virtual planetarium. We've started with a website that will showcase excellence in STEAM education, and this website, we hope, will have global reach, but it will focus on local curriculum elements. We want to give a platform to the Canadian experience of crossing the boundary between Earth and space. And this includes using perspectives and voices from Canada's many different cultures, including those Indigenous to our shores. Our virtual planetarium and eventual facility will be a showcase for how to use technologies such as virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence to build an innovative and exciting storytelling platform. Now, you might wonder why we want to do this. Well, ultimately, it's to inspire. Space Place will be built for the love of science and technology. It will be built to inspire, to share knowledge, and to help explore the world around us. We hope to be a beacon of support for those who are looking to learn something new and exciting in Earth and space sciences. At Space Place, we not only explore tomorrow, we build for it as well. We know that it is vital to promote engagement with STEAM, that is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, particularly to inspire young people to consider careers in the sciences and STEAM topics. So we like to say that every day will be career day at Space Place. We believe also that a facility like this belongs in Toronto. This city is, after all, the center of the universe. With apologies to my friends who actually run the actual center of the universe, which is in Victoria, British Columbia. Now, this is a very lofty goal that we have, and right now we are not putting shovels in the ground. We are not drawing up architectural plans yet, but we are running events. This is our first online event tonight, first of many. We'll have another one on December 10th, and then hopefully more in the spring. We will have more in the spring, and then hopefully we'll be starting them up more regularly. But it does take some money and time to run events like this, so we would like you to please consider supporting us. Now, we're not a charity yet, but we hopefully will be soon. Instead of a tax receipt for a donation tonight, we're happy to send you some gifts. And what I'd like to do is actually show you the gifts that we'd like to offer you tonight. So I'm going to try to share my screen and show you some of the wonderful things that we will have. Now, it's going to take me a second to find this. Here we go. Oh, no, I'm not finding it. There it is. Okay. So I hope that all of you can see this on my screen. If you send us a $30 donation tonight, you can choose between a stylish Space Place face mask, modeled here by our illustrious chair, Henry Lowton, or, and actually I have to confess, this is my favorite gift, a music download card. And on this download site, you can get music that was composed for the McLaughlin Planetarium between 1969 and 1995. The 2 composers are Tim Clark and Michael Dana. And interestingly, Michael Dana, who lives in Los Angeles and composes music for movies now, actually rescued some old tapes and got them transferred so that he could put this music up for us to use to help raise money for our project. We also have some books. Holidays are coming up. Books are always a good gift. We have lots of copies of An Earthling's Guide to Outer Space by Bob McDonald. That's the host of CBC Quirks and Quarks, who was at our January event. We have a limited number of other books as well, including Defying Limits by Dave Williams, the Canadian astronaut, and The Science of Why by the ever-popular Jay Ingram. Also, if you can't choose, you can give us $100 and we'll give you one of each. You can have all three. So I hope that you'll consider visiting our website, spaceplacecanada.ca, and click Donate by PayPal. Make sure you include your email address because we'll want to talk to you about which gift you'd like to choose. Okay, now let's see if I can get out of here and back to the screen. Alrighty. Now, we also are very fortunate to enjoy the support of several organizations, including Stradia, who helped create our brand and our website, Global Public Affairs, who helps us get the word out about our events, and we are also delighted to have MDA as a Jupiter-level sponsor. And I would like to welcome Lauren Chan, who's Manager of Marketing and Communications for MDA, to say a few words about the exciting things that are happening over there. Welcome, Lauren.
Thanks, Kirsten. Well, first off, thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. For those who do not know of us, MDA is Canada's leading space tech company. We've worked on exciting space robotics, such as the Canadarms. And this year, we actually became a once again Canadian company. So we're excited to be back on Canadian soil. And, we all know Canada has played such an important role in space. So creating this public awareness and discourse with Space Place is so important. And MDA is so proud to support this initiative, and we look forward to seeing what's in store next. And to get us all in the spirit of tonight's festivities, I wanted to share with you our new brand video, which just launched last month. So Kirsten, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That's a very exciting looking video and a beautiful new logo that MDA has. We are so happy to welcome MDA back to being a Canadian company, and thank you again for your sponsorship. Now, that's all the initial stuff out of the way, but we're here tonight to look back at Canada's contributions to the space exploration, the space world. And when we were thinking about this event and who we would invite, it turned out, we thought, well, you know what? We have a director of Space Place Canada who would be perfect for this. Many of you may know Randy Attwood. I have known him for more years than I am willing to admit on this broadcast tonight. In fact, he has been a mentor to me throughout my years from a time that I will not divulge. We've been connected through many of the things that Randy has been involved with, and specifically through the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. So if you don't know Randy, though, let me tell you a few things about him. He's been following Canadian and international space activities since 1968. Okay, he put the date in. I wouldn't. He's past president of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada and was recently the executive director of the same society. He has witnessed a whopping 12 space shuttle launches, including the 2nd and the 35th. And we could really not think of a better person to talk about Canada's history in space than Randy. So please join me in welcoming him now.
Kirsten, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And hello, everybody, and thank you very much for participating in this, this special event. Tonight I'm going to look back at Canada and the final frontier. And this is a huge topic, so excuse me if I just sort of skim over the top, but I wanted to touch on as many different aspects of the history of Canada's exploration and use of space and development of space technologies. So I'm going to talk a little bit pre-Sputnik, and then we'll talk about Sputnik and how it really just changed everything around the world. That the space race had begun. Canada entered that space race, or the space age, pretty quickly with its Alouette satellite. There was a report called the Chapman Report in the mid-'60s, which had a major effect on the future of the Canadian space program. And then, as we all know, I changed all my manned space to crewed space in my presentation, but that one got missed. So crewed space program, we have had many Canucks in space, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll touch on to the moon and Mars, but as Kirsten said, our December 10th presentation is part 2 of this presentation. It'll be looking forward to Canada in space. So the development of rocketry really happened in the 20th century when essentially it became possible. That is, you had some people like Robert Goddard and Wernher von Braun who were very, very smart people, but it wasn't until the technology was available that they could develop the materials and the mechanics to actually develop rockets that would work. So even though they were rather rudimentary in the 20s when Robert Goddard developed his first rocket, it wasn't long before men like von Braun, who wanted to go to the stars, saw that rockets could also be used, unfortunately, in warfare. By the 50s, rockets were getting better. A lot of them still blew up. But in the 1957-1958 International Geophysical Year, part of that was to see who would be the first country to put a satellite, an artificial satellite, in Earth orbit. The United States said that they would launch a satellite, and they were going to investigate the near-Earth space environment with it. The Canadian Defense Research Board was approached by NASA to start work on a scientific project for the IGY. But it was the Soviet Union who won the race, and their launch of Sputnik 1 into Earth orbit on October 4th, 1957, of course, changed everything. Meanwhile, the U.S. efforts were not doing so well. This was Vanguard 1's attempt to launch. And of course, the next day, all the newspaper headlines called it a Flopnik. It did have a little satellite, which in fact survived the explosion, and it was recovered. Now it's in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. If you're ever down there, look for that little guy who somehow survived the explosion. But the U.S. was still keen to get going. Their pride was really bruised with the Soviets, which was considered to be a less technological country, beating them into space. But there was also panic. If the Soviets could put a large satellite into Earth orbit, then they certainly could. They would be a threat to the U.S. Putting bombs or something in Earth orbit as well. So there was a certain aspect of defense concerns, but also, as I mentioned, ego, and there was an effort by Eisenhower to start working on an education program, whereas a planetarium was built in every school board across the country, and many of those planetariums, I believe, are still in use today. They created NASA, and the space age had really begun. Here in Canada, there was definite interest in space, and certainly the defense aspect of it, since our position was right in between the Soviet Union and the U.S. So the National Research Council and Defense Research Boards were created, and Canadians began to look not at science, the science aspect of space exploration. We have the North Magnetic Pole in Canada, and we have been using the ionosphere for long-distance shortwave communications especially to the north. Canada is such a huge country that we depended on shortwave communications to connect the country together, especially in the far north. Part of the defense aspect in Canada was the development of the Avro Arrow, and by coincidence, the first flight aircraft was rolled out the same day Sputnik launched. But that project was canceled for many reasons, and still it's controversial today. But we'll get back to the Avro in a little bit. So satellites were now being developed and launched, and these satellites could be either in low Earth orbits at various inclinations to the equator, or they could be in higher orbits like polar orbits or even geostationary orbits where communication satellites would go. So there was great interest in building and developing satellites to oversee weather and Earth resources and communications. And as I say, the space age had begun, and they were countries were developing satellites as quickly as they could. Early satellite design was a challenge. You needed to power a satellite in space, and solar cells were just being developed. The satellite had to survive in a harsh environment, the vacuum of space and the harsh temperatures. You had to be able to communicate with your satellite. It had to be able to maintain an attitude so that it could point its antennas in the right direction and perform the work that it had to do. Computers were very, very big, and it was difficult to even find a computer that you could put on a satellite at that point in time. So that was a major challenge. But the purpose of the satellite was to put a payload on it and instruments that would then perform a certain function. Even the vibration at launch had to be simulated. And the upshot was that even though we're used to satellites lasting years and years, back then early satellites lasted days or even weeks, but not that long at all. So Canada started to develop the Alouette satellite. And Alouette was to be used to study the ionosphere. The official name is it was an ionospheric topside sounder. And essentially, in the ionosphere, there are electrically charged atomic particles at the very top of the Earth's atmosphere. And it was used for long-distance radio communication. The radio waves were bounced off the ionosphere from the ground, and that was the way that people could communicate long distances. So the focus for Canada early on was really scientific programs, developing Alouette and other satellites to investigate the upper atmosphere all across the country. Alouette was built in Toronto, in Downsview, actually, up near the airport, Downsview Airport, and it was launched in a near polar orbit and by the Americans. So it was a joint Canada-U.S. project, and for launching the satellite, the Americans were able to obtain data from the satellite. So Canada was the third country to build and launch a satellite, even though we had a partner help us. So here are some of the people responsible for working on Alouette. You get a good idea of the size of the spacecraft. And Alouette required to do its job and to emit the radio frequencies that it had to emit, it needed some long radio antennas. And to do that, you couldn't launch the satellite with these antennas deployed. So again, the Canadians, what we'll find is Canadians, even though we don't have a great population and a big budget, we're very innovative. And something called the Storable Tubular Extendable Member, or STEM, another STEM acronym just to confuse things, was developed and essentially stem is a beryllium copper roll of metal that's heated in a tubular shape and then stored flat. And so you can see the mechanism there. And once in space, the stem antenna would be unfurled, and the flat metal would automatically turn into a tube. And they were able to make extremely long antennas that way. And the Alouette would be spinning while it's in orbit. There is a really good documentary called Space Pioneers by Rudy Butenal. I didn't find it on YouTube, but it is available in some libraries. So if you're interested in the Alouette story, then find this video. It's really, really well done. So there were some follow-on missions to Alouette 1, Alouette 2, and ISIS 1 and 2, which were, again, they built on the data developed by, or the data and what was found by Alouette 1 by the previous mission. ISIS 2 actually carried a camera, and it was the first to photograph the auroral ring. So these international satellites for ionospheric studies, ISIS 1 and ISIS 2 were flown in the late 60s. Meanwhile, there were other ways to study the upper atmosphere without going into orbit, and that is using these research rockets, these Black Brants, which were launched from the Churchill, Manitoba site on the shore of Hudson's Bay. And these rockets would soar several hundred kilometers above the Earth, and between 1960 and 1984, hundreds of these Black Brants were sent up. This facility was closed in 1984 due to lack of funding. So there's a picture of a Black Brant going up. In the mid-60s, John Chapman, who you see him there standing beside the rocket that launched Alouette, he's considered to be the father of Canada's space program. He was involved with the Alouette, with the Avro-Aero program, and with the early satellite programs, and ultimately was involved with the U.S. Gemini program. He wrote this report in 1966 called the Upper Atmosphere and Space Programs in Canada report. It's really called the Chapman report. And it laid out plans for the Canadian space research for the next several decades. Part of that report looked at communications, which obviously we've been talking about the need for that in a large country like Canada. Earth observation, which includes resources, and then really laid out a Canadian space industry, the need for a space agency, and the need for test facilities. Canada, I guess, with regard to further satellites and scientific investigation, Canada partnered with various countries, such as Sweden in 1986, to study the upper atmosphere and the aurora borealis. They worked with the Japanese on a satellite to study the magnetic fields around the Earth. Ulysses was a European satellite that went into polar orbit around the sun, and they developed some instrumentation for that. And the UARS, the Upper Atmosphere Research Satellite, was developed primarily to study atomic oxygen in the upper atmosphere and the destruction of the protective ozone layer. And this WINDY project, that was developed at York University. And it measured the temperature and solar wind velocity in near-Earth space between 70 and 300 kilometers altitude. So that, in the early 90s, when it became apparent that the ozone layer was depleting, Canada did get involved with projects to study that. Another project was SciSat, which was again the ACE satellite, atmospheric chemistry experiment, and it was also used to take measurements of the Earth's atmosphere and essentially to look at the depletion of the ozone in the Arctic. MOST was a great project. It was our Hubble telescope. The prime scientific investigator called it the Hubble Space Telescope. It certainly wasn't as expensive as Hubble, but it was a telescope that was put into Earth orbit. The orbit that it went into was such that it was always facing the sun. So it had solar panels on one side, and it had a telescope on the other side that was developed to look constantly for weeks at a time at the changing brightness of a star. That's something you can't do on Earth, of course, because of daytime, it's half the time. And also in orbit, if you're not in the right orbit, then you still go into the Earth's shadow, or the star would set behind the Earth. So this satellite was quite unique. MOST stands for Micro Variability and Oscillations of Stars. And here is MOST, to give you an example of the size of MOST at the University of Toronto Aerospace Institute, not long before it was shipped to Russia for launch. There are a lot of people involved in developing projects like this. Slavik Rushinsky, considered to be the father of MOST, is a U of T astronomer. And Robert Z is an engineer who helped design and develop the spacecraft. That little, it's not a very big spacecraft. You certainly can't put rocket engines on a spacecraft like that to keep it still in orbit, that is pointed at the star that you want to point it at, and keep it pointed at that star for weeks at a time. And the answer was reaction wheels. And Kieran Carroll developed these reaction wheels, and there were, I think, 4 of them, 3 of them at right angles to each other, and then a 4th one as a backup. And essentially, reaction wheels spin up or slow down at different rates, and that actually slowly turns the spacecraft and keeps it pointed in the right direction. Quite unique. Hubble has the same, but their reaction wheels are big, and of course they had to be changed out several times. So that's MOST on a table during early development and testing. They're the guts of a satellite under development. A similar satellite like MOST is NEOSat, which was launched, and its job was to look for near-Earth objects, but also it looked down on Earth artificial satellites in orbit around Earth. As time went on, you begin to get smaller satellites, what are called nanosatellites, and these are very small, and they can be many of them can be launched on one rocket. These are some examples of some Canadian nanosatellites, and this one was another astronomy satellite that was launched. So that's the science end of things. Communications satellites, again, was a big of interest in the early 70s. Our first communications satellite was Anik, meaning brother in Inuvik, and it was launched on an American rocket in 1972. We developed and had Hermes launch, which was an experimentation of advanced technology for communications. But this was communications was a big effort by the government. They created Telesat Canada in 1969 to oversee the communications satellite industry. And just to give you an idea of the distribution of signals from a communication satellite, all the communication satellites are on the equator, about 36,000 kilometers above the equator, and that is the range of communications back in the 70s. So this was important for various reasons. Certainly communication, but also telemedicine. Various aspects of just being able to distribute television to the high Arctic was impossible until we had communication satellites. So here is a list of some of the communication satellites that were launched in the 70s and the 80s, and then through the 90s. One of the first Annex C satellites was launched on a space shuttle. In fact, it was launched on STS-5. This was the first operational shuttle after the first 4 experimental test flights. And it was a beautiful sunset that night. It's Columbia on the pad. And the next morning, around 7:30 in the morning, I think it was, this is a view I had of the launch from the press site. And you'll see that if you were a paying customer back then, you had your logo, Telesat Canada, there with the Canadian flag. So there were 2 satellites on board this satellite on this shuttle mission, and so 2 paying customers. 7 months later, another Anik was launched on Challenger, STS-7, which launched about an hour or so after I took this picture, just after sunrise. Here is a painting by a good friend of mine, Paul Fjeld, of Anik E. Gives you an idea of how high the communication satellites are. Earth resources, remote sensing, and Earth resources was a very of interest to the Canadian space industry. Primarily, just monitoring our vast land, our huge country, and being able to monitor resources. And we did that by partnering with the U.S. With the Landsat program. And we were able to receive data from those missions and monitor resources and land use. And it was very, very important. We developed our own Earth resources satellites called RadarSat, and we were the first to develop satellites which use synthetic aperture radar to monitor Earth resources and the Earth systems. It was launched. There are 2 of them. One was launched in 1995. The other one in 2007, and they're very high, 800 kilometers in height. But the beauty of RadarSat was, since it didn't use light, but it used radar, then it could see through clouds. It could work essentially, you could use it all the time. Saw through clouds, you could use it during the day and night. And it provided information on coastal waters, geology, environmental changes. But it was also, there were other countries that were interested in obtaining the data, and we were able to sell this data. And here's an example of a RadarSat image. We also partnered with with France and several other countries where we developed these search and rescue technology items, which flew on aircraft and were on boats. And essentially, if there was a distress call, then that technology would signal a Soviet satellite, which would then trigger search and rescue. The first use of it was in British Columbia in 1982. And the data I have here is the system saved over 14,000 lives. Each radio beacon costs less than $1,000, and over 35 countries are taking part in this program, which still runs today. David Florida was one of Canada's foremost pioneers in space research, and he was involved in the early space telecommunications in Canada, as well as he worked on the ISIS program. And when the Canadian Space Agency needed a place to test and prepare satellites for launch, they named the lab after David Florida. So the David Florida Lab is just outside of Ottawa, and it is used essentially to, as I say, prepare satellites, test them, put them in a simulated space environment to make sure that everything works properly before they're shipped off for launch. We didn't have a space agency until 1989. Essentially, our space program was run by various groups, including the National Research Council. So the name of our headquarters at the Canadian Space Agency in Saint Hubert, Quebec, is named after John Chapman. And this is where the big decisions are made. Find that the Canadian budget for space has been about $300 million since 2001 and has not changed. So one of the concerns is that we don't spend a lot on space. We spend 1/4 of what the US spends per capita, in other words, per person. So that is one aspect that if you'd say that there was an issue with our space program, it's underfunded, and there are efforts to do something about that and come up with long-term plans, but generally those that don't tend to come out. Canada has been on interplanetary missions, like to Mars and to the planets. We were involved with the Cassini-Huygens mission, and we've been involved with several of the Mars missions. The Phoenix spacecraft, which landed on in the northern latitudes of Mars several years ago. It had a little weather station on it, a Canadian meteorological station. And with its LiDAR system, this weather station was able to detect snow on Mars. And wherever we go, we want to put our logo. So there's the Canadian logo on the MET system on a spacecraft on Mars. And just a few weeks ago, the OSIRIS-REx satellite, which we have a LiDAR system installed, and actually when I was at MDA a year and a bit ago, I was able to see the backup engineering test rig for the LiDAR that's on this the spacecraft. This spacecraft actually, you can see the extension arm there, it actually got very, very close to and touched the satellite, or the asteroid, a few weeks ago, obtained a rather considerable sample, and now that sample will be returned to Earth in 2023. And Canadian scientists who participated with this will get some of their own samples to work with. Now, going back to Avro Arrow, the thing about the Arrow was that, as I say, Canadians are innovative, and the people working on the Arrow had to develop new technologies in the areas of high-speed propulsion, mechanical, and electrical design. So we had to be rather ingenious to do these things. And as I say, this program was canceled around the same time the Americans chose their astronauts, their first 7 Mercury astronauts. Meanwhile, the American space program needed some long antennas, which were stored in a very small place. And so the Alouette stems actually found their way onto Mercury spacecraft and Gemini and Apollo spacecraft. After the Avro Arrow was canceled, Bob Gilruth, who was the head of manned space they were in Langley, Virginia at the time, in NASA, he came up to Toronto and interviewed several of the engineers who worked on the Avro Arrow, many of them Canadians, some of them from Britain. But they were all hired, or at least 30 of them were hired, and they went off to Langley, Virginia to work on Mercury and ultimately the Gemini and Apollo spacecraft. They trained astronauts, They were doctors. They planned the moon missions, ran the receiving lab where the samples came back from the moon, and essentially had a major impact on the success of the U.S. space program. This whole story is really well documented in Chris Gaynor's book, Arrows to the Moon. And so if you're interested in this story, then definitely I would pick up Chris's book. Owen Maynard was a really, really amazing guy. Got to know him fairly well, primarily because my dad's secretary's cousin was married to him, and she knew that I was interested in space. And so in 1992, I linked up with Owen and spent many hours with him talking about his days at NASA. And there you see an early version of the lunar module there. Owen was involved with planning the Apollo missions. During Apollo 11, he was in fact the chief engineer, and he and another fellow, Tom Kelly, are really known as the fathers of the LEM. Owen on the NASA end, and Tom Kelly on the Grumman the company Grumman that actually built the lunar module. And here are the two of them in a support room during the Apollo 11 mission. So these two guys, if anyone is considered to be the father of the lunar module, it's these two guys. And so with all the support from Canadians, as we all know, the first moon landing took place on Apollo 11. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the mission, and Canada Post put out a stamp to commemorate the event. And it was recognized in part of the write-up about the company, well, it was Hero at the time, but now it's Hero DivTech. And it's a company in Longueuil, Quebec, not very far away from the Space Agency headquarters. And they actually manufactured the landing gear for the lunar modules. And there's a long story that Chris writes about in his book. Not the landing pads, unfortunately, but the landing gear and the struts on all of the lunar modules were built in Quebec. Part of the stamp booklet recognizes two famous Canadians who we've talked about in the space program, James Chamberlain. We haven't talked about James Chamberlain. Jim Chamberlain was involved with the Avro Arrow, and also with he was one of the Avro Arrow guys to come down to NASA and worked on Gemini, and then of course Owen Maynard. After Apollo, there was the U.S. looked at next steps, which was a reusable spacecraft called the Shuttle, and there was this a division of de Havilland Aircraft called Special Products and Research Division, or SPAR, which was spun off into a separate company, and they started to look into doing some work on the shuttle, and in 1974 proposed building a 50-foot arm for this the shuttle, and they got the contract. They were given $100 million from the Canadian government to build the arm, and with the idea that the first one would be given to NASA, and NASA would buy any of the others that it needed. But also it would give us some seats on the space shuttle, and essentially would be an opportunity for us to put put the first Canadians in space. SPAR left the field in 1998, and that's when it was, I believe the SPAR component was purchased by McDonnell Detweiler. So that's where our friends at McDonnell Detweiler came on the scene. So in 1983, the call came out for astronaut candidates, and the first 6 astronauts are seen there, with the idea of launching in 1985 or 1986 the first Canadian astronaut. The arm was flown on the second shuttle mission on Columbia. And I remember talking to Art Hunter at the National Research Council, who was the project lead on the arm. And when the orbiter was being prepared for the mission, and they were loading the arm onto the installing it onto the shuttle onto Columbia, that was the point where they went in and actually put the Canada word mark on the arm. The U.S. had absolutely no idea this was going to happen, and Art told me that it caused a little bit of grief. And if you look at pictures in the payload bay of shuttles for that mission, they've got this huge U.S. flag plastered at the back of the payload bay because they didn't want people around the world thinking that the shuttle was Canadian. But the arm definitely bought us a ticket into space. The first opportunity to fly into space came a little earlier than was thought. That was a mission in 1984. The astronauts were picked to work on two specific experiments on flight, and so they were called, our first Canadian astronauts were called payload specialists, meaning they didn't operate the shuttle. They just went up. They knew how to not get in trouble on the shuttle by throwing the wrong switch or something. But they mainly spent most of their time working on specific experiments. There were two experiments. One was a medical experiment called the Space Adaptation Syndrome, which was essentially investigating why some astronauts got sick in space and others didn't. And the second one was a space vision system to try to determine exactly where things were in space, especially when they were on the end of the arm. So Marc Garneau was our first astronaut in October 1984. And this was a picture I took of him just before he got into the Astrovan. So I might have been the last Canadian to wish him Godspeed and have a good flight. We set up a Canadian flag down by the countdown clock. And again, this was another early morning launch. CBC actually picked up our flag at some point during their broadcast. And there is the launch, picked up by a remote camera that we set up out by the beach. So this is a montage by my friend Paul Field showing different aspects of the mission, including us. He was with us at the flag. That's why he painted. He didn't paint himself in, but he painted us. Many of you know Terry Dickinson. He was down there writing for Maclean's magazine, actually. And my friend Michael Watson were there watching the launch. And then there is part of the mission of 41G, the Challenger, with the Canadarm extended there. So as more and more astronauts, Canadian astronauts, went into space, we went from payload specialist to mission specialist. And a mission specialist meant that you spent a lot of time, you were part of the astronaut team of astronauts who went through a 2-year training period and learned how to operate the shuttle. You didn't learn how to fly it or pilot it. But one of the things our astronauts as mission specialists did was to learn how to operate the arm. And Chris Hadfield was the first to do that on his mission on STS-74. The arm was used nearly all the time to help astronauts get to certain points in the payload bay, if they were working on constructing something, or if they were accessing the Hubble, and the arm would be used to grab satellites like Hubble and place it into the payload bay. That Hubble is, it's big, and you never really realize how big it is until you stand beside the engineering model. And this was at the Air and Space Museum. Man, that is a big telescope. In the mid 80s, Prime Minister Mulroney had the Reagans as guests in Quebec City for a what's called the Shamrock Summit. But this was the opportunity where Canada decided to join the space station project. And this was an opportunity for us to offer more robotics expertise, primarily what we call now the Canadarm2. By then, we had some more astronauts. Some of the initial ones had moved on, but we still had some new astronauts. And here are our current astronauts today. Jeremy Hansen, David St. Jacques, who's been on the space station. Jeremy will be the next one to go up. And our two newer astronauts, Joshua Kutfik and Jenny Scheide. So as mission specialists, you train to take spacewalks. And Chris Hadfield was our first spacewalker. And what he did was he was on a mission where the Canadarm2 was actually placed on the space station. And the Canadarm2 actually consists of not just the arm, but a structure that moves the arm across the spine of the space station, but also a little robot called the Special Purpose Dextrose Manipulator. And thank goodness for acronyms, so we just call it the SPDM, but everyone calls it Dexter. And here's another field painting depicting what the Canadarm2 system would look like in space. And again, this structure, it essentially moves on a railroad track along the length of the spine of the space station, and it was used to construct the space station. Large pieces would come up in the shuttle, and the arm would put it in place, and then spacewalkers would do the physical and electrical connections. And there is that MSS, I believe it was called, which essentially was the little car that moves the Canadarm2 across the space station. The interesting thing about the Canadarm2 is it had, unlike the shuttle arm, which was connected at one end, the Canadarm2 can actually walk like a little inchworm, where it can grapple onto one of the grapple fixtures you see there, and then grapple onto another one, and then the first one unhook and grapple to another one, and it can move all around because each of those grapple fixtures supplies power and data. There's a close-up of Dexter. The purpose of Dexter is just to perform tasks outside on the maintenance on the space station, which would preclude having to send an astronaut out to do it. Because every time you send an astronaut out for a spacewalk, there's always risk. And so Dexter he's got a whole bunch of tools which he can then perform these tasks like replacing faulty equipment or changing out batteries. And there's Dexter mounted on the side of the space station. One thing that MDA delivered in an incredibly short period of time was the OBSS, which essentially was the long arm extension that was used post-Columbia accident, after the Columbia accident, when it was required that the astronauts do a full inspection of their thermal protection system after launch and before entry. And this arm was constructed up in Brampton at MDA and used for all the shuttle missions after Columbia. So we've had astronauts on the space station. This is Robert Thirsk during his stay on the station, and Julie Payette was on a shuttle mission that came up. And so we had actually two Canadians in space at the same time. That's the only time that's happened. And of course, Chris Hadfield, when he was the first Canadian commander of the space station when he was up there. And of course, he did some music videos at the same time. And our recent astronaut, David St. Jacques, in the pergola with the arm in the background and the Canadian flag. What else do you need? And this, what really bugs my American friends when I show them this, because our money has space stuff on it, and theirs don't. And I was at a conference a a few years ago, and I actually had a couple $5 bills in my wallet, and I gave them to the commanders of the first 2 missions that flew the shuttle arm. And I said, look at this. And they thought that was pretty cool. So that's looking back. What about the future? Well, that's really not what we're going to go into too much today, except obviously the moon is our next major step outside of low Earth orbit and ultimately to Mars. We are involved with the Lunar Gateway project, which essentially is Canadarm3, another arm which will be attached, as you can see there, on a lunar orbiting base, which will be used to send people down to the lunar surface. So I hope not too far in the future, when people, men and women, go to the moon again, we will be part of that project. Meanwhile, the CSA has a new president, Lisa Campbell, and she will be guiding us through that program over the next few years. So we wish her all the best. And just to finish up here, I wanted to share some resources, just in case you're looking for some Christmas presents, and for someone who's interested in Canada and space, because there are some good ones out there, some books written on the history. Doris Jelly's Canada's 25 Years in Space, and there's a 50-year in space written by Gordon Shepard and Agnes Cruccio. Lydia Dotto, who was a reporter, and in fact she was the first woman. She was on the Ticonderoga when Apollo 17 splashed down. So she was the first woman reporter to actually be on an aircraft carrier during the recovery of a space mission. So she's written a couple books on Canada and space. And this is a brand new book. A friend of mine, Elizabeth Howell, I don't have this book yet, but it was on Quirks and Quarks the other day. Bob McDonald interviewed Elizabeth, and it looks like a really great book. So there's a book to consider. Then I mentioned Chris Gaynor earlier. He has a history of Canada and space, and Bob McDonald, Quirks and Quarks, has a great book on our Canadian spacewalkers. And we have some astronauts who have written some books. David Williams has written a book on his experiences, and Chris Hadfield, of course, has several books to his name. This one is his first one. And Roberta Bondar, who was really inspired during her flight, looking down at the Earth, and gotten into photography and environmentalism and all of that. So that's just a quick look at the past 50 some odd years, or nearly 60 years, of Canada and space. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll pass this back to Kirsten.
Well, actually, we're going to be on screen together for a little bit because I'm going to ask you some questions. Woo-hoo. Thank you very much for that. I have actually learned quite a lot. I thought I knew a lot of this stuff already, but I didn't, because you know a ton more. Just to get the questions going, and remind everybody that please use the comments in YouTube to ask a question you might want to have to Randy. And I'm just going to ask a few that I had of my own, because I'm controlling things here, so I get to do that. I just also want to remind you, you can visit our website at spaceplacecanada.ca, and right on there you'll see that donate PayPal button. And please remember, $30, you can get a face mask with branded Space Place Canada. You can get the download card for the wonderful planetarium music. For $50, you can get a book. And actually, I have my signed copy of Bob McDonald's book from January right here. There are other books as well, a limited number. And for $100, you can get all three. And I really start to feel like I'm Goldie from PBS in both. Remember her? Anyway, there you go. I've got the same eyeshadow, though. So, Randy, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is Canada's biggest contribution to the international space community? It's like the most important thing we've done.
Yeah, I think that is a tough question. I mean,
sorry.
And in fact, I saw the question earlier, and I still have been thinking about it. When I talked to Owen about Apollo, and he said when people asked him how important were the Germans' contribution to Apollo, he would always say nearly as important as the Canadians. I think we're we're very proud of what we do. As I keep going back to, we do a lot with what we have, which isn't much. So we have to be innovative and smart, and we have to bring a lot of knowledge and technology to the table. I think we work well with other countries because we have to. That's why I put in all of those international cooperative missions in there. Let's face it. We are a little mouse sleeping beside a big elephant, and in space as well. And if the U.S. wants to go off and do something on their own, well, there's not much we can do. We will never have. Hopefully we will launch our own rockets. There's been some talk about putting a launch site, say on the East Coast somewhere, maybe Cape Breton Island.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, but I guess that can be for our next event in December.
Well, but that's because satellites are getting so small now that it's easier to send them into space. But we will only go to the moon if we go with another country, and it probably will be with the U.S. and Europeans and Japanese. But we've the contribution of the robotics. I look at that as it's ingenious. But could other countries have participated and provided robotics? Yes. I mean, the Japanese has a module on the space station, and they've got their own little arm on it. So we must be contributing a lot because we continue to be asked back to the table as we go farther out in space.
That's what it seemed like to me. And I was struck by a conversation I had with Robert Thirsk one time. And his very deep conviction that going into space it had the potential to, I don't really want to overstate it, but save humanity because of the fact that you had to cooperate. I know this is sort of maybe a romantic view of Canada, that we are a country that likes compromise and cooperation, but do you see that as an important thing in the history of our space program? And do you think it'll affect, I think you've already answered that to some extent going forward.
No, I do. And it's interesting too. Originally the space station was not going to include Russia. Mm-hmm. And then it was determined to include Russia. Well, that had a big impact on us, because if you don't include Russia, then you can launch from Florida in a lower inclined orbit to the equator, and you can put more stuff into orbit. Mm-hmm. But once you include Russia, it means the orbit of the space station is so high that now your rockets can only put so much payload into orbit, because you lose a lot of the rotation of the Earth in it. But anyway, the fact that Russia has been part of the space station during the last 4 to 8 years, when there have been times where they say the U.S. and the Russians aren't, they weren't speaking too much, and kind of reminded me of, I don't know if you remember the 2010 movie. Where they're going to Jupiter, and they have this big problem, and the Russians go off into their module, and the Americans go off into their module. They're not allowed to talk to each other. And I really expected that to happen at some point. And the fact that it hasn't, maybe that's been something that's sort of settled. Calm down, everybody. We've got all these astronauts working together and living together in space, and it's interesting. These. When the Americans and the Soviets, or whenever that happened, Soviets or Russians, started flying together, the pilots of one, the American astronauts and the Russian astronauts who were pilots, they talk to each other about, were you flying that MiG that I was buzzing back in such and such, and they'd have all these stories where they were sort of buzzing each other during these events. And, they were mortal. They were enemies way back then. But it's interesting, because I often think of what Owen and some of the other Canadians told me. Owen flew Mosquitoes in World War II. And then 10 years after that or so, he's working with Germans to put people in space. That must have been tough. And I think for a lot of the people who were working in, say, Huntsville or Houston, that was tough, working with these...
the enemy.
The enemy, right? Yeah. So, it is the whole ISS, when you do talk to people like Bob or others who have been directly involved with it, they can't say enough about how monumental the task is. I mean, the ISS has been up there for 20, or there have been people in the ISS for 20 years now straight, and it just seems like the ISS is still up there and people are going up, people are going down, but what a monumental task to keep that thing going and to have all of these different countries being involved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got to say something for international cooperation in a big way.
It must, and I do like to think of Canada as being a good broker of that cooperation. But I hope going forward. I have another sort of flip question for you, and then there's a few coming in on the YouTube chat, so we'll get to those. But why do you think Canada was so good at branding our space equipment, whereas the US kind of forgot about it?
Yeah,
that story. I've always loved that story about the Canadarm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for the longest time, the shuttle arm was the SSRMS, or the Canadian arm,
mm-hmm.
and it wasn't a while. It took a while before it got its Canadarm1 or Canadarm name. But for the longest time, the Americans, like if you heard, say, the NASA public affairs people on NASA TV talking about the shuttle mission, they would never call it the Canadarm. It was always, and the shuttle arm.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think it's the coolest thing to be able to have an arm in space and pick up stuff and whatever. And I must admit, when I was at the space agency once, and it was around the time of Chris Hadfield's first mission when he went to Mir, and he was the first to use the arm. And there was the simulator sitting there, and we were offered a chance to use it. And one of the things that Chris did is he picked up this module and stuck it on the airlock on the shuttle. And this big orange module was going to stay on Mir, and all the shuttle missions were going to dock to it.
Dock to it, yeah.
So I had an opportunity to pick it up, and the arm was so easy to use. I had absolutely no trouble throwing it. And you see this multi-million-dollar module going flying. But
I'm glad you didn't do that.
Yeah, that was what was so cool about the arm. So the fact that we always stuck our name on it, I think too, was cool.
It's nice, easy brand. Well, let's see here. First of all, we have a comment from Nadeem who says, "Randy, you rock. You didn't skip a beat that whole talk. Amazing," which is nice to hear. We had somebody who commented that there was a satellite called CSAT that used synthetic aperture, maybe before RadarSat 1. Not sure, but it does sound a little bit familiar anyway.
Yeah, I think Magellan also used similar technology to
map Venus. That's right. It was the big first extra planetary, like beyond Earth use of SAR. Yeah.
I don't.
Amazing.
It didn't necessarily develop the technology. I didn't mean to suggest that. But.
Yeah, RadarSat though, and that was pretty neat. The way they used to, do that. I remember seeing exhibits of the RadarSat imagery because they were so beautiful in their weird way.
I don't know if we've flown them yet. Have we flown the 3 RadarSats now, once following each other in orbit? I don't remember if maybe someone can look that up and see, but I know that we were planning to send up 3 RadarSats in a row. They may be up there already.
So, if anybody who's listening knows the answer to that, put the answer in the comments and then we'll know.
And you get a mask.
Yeah, that's it. You get a mask. That's sure. If you answer that question and we can verify that it's true, we'll send you a mask as long as we know what your email address is. So Henry asks if you can describe for us some other companies that have made major contributions to equipment in NASA missions. And he's thinking particularly about ESA or maybe the JAXA space agencies there. So, what are the notable contributions to these programs? So, I guess what that is, companies that made major contributions to equipment in NASA missions, or, partnerships between Canadian companies and companies and space agencies other than NASA. So,
well, we do have the space industry in Canada is huge. And I hope that I'm sure our speaker will talk about that, what MDA specifically, but Canada in general. And when we were initially talking to MDA about Spaceplace at their headquarters in Brampton, we talked about that and how there are so many companies that are building things for not necessarily Canadian projects but international projects, and it's not something that the average person knows about. I know ComDev, which I think has been sold to Honeywell now, but ComDev was when I went and visited them years ago, they were building all the Iridium satellite antennas, and that was the Iridium satellite was the initial cell phone that you could use anywhere on the planet because you're connecting directly with a satellite.
And the first astronomical light pollution from those satellites too,
yes.
Right? The Iridium flares. Remember them?
Those were pretty cool.
They were cool, and they were so transient. But anyway, that's another thing.
So there were, but a lot of these companies, the smaller ones, may have been bought up by other companies over time, and I think it's. These companies have to have, look at the commercialization in the States. SpaceX is doing as well as it's doing because they initially got a lot of money from NASA to develop their systems to take, the Dragons to the ISS with supplies and then with people. And I'm not so sure that that's happening all that much in Canada. So maybe that's one of the reasons. But certainly, if you're looking at the way other countries work with NASA, there's a Japanese module on the space station. There's the European contribution on the space station, and these contributions are essentially buying them hours of people time on the space station. And able to give their scientists experiments time to work on the space station. So the Europeans now are building essentially a service module for the spacecraft that will take people to back to the moon. So before an Apollo, those were all made in the U.S. in California. Yeah. Now you're getting different countries around the world contributing for these projects, and now we're just in the beginning of really analyzing how we're going to get back to the moon and who is going to go and who's going to contribute what. And right now, with this whole signing of the Artemis agreement recently, Canada being in there, that gives us an opportunity to participate.
So I guess it's kind of interesting to think with the private sector starting to roll into space, whether that kind of cooperation will still be possible or if it'll even be amplified by that. I don't know if you have any feelings on that. I don't really know much about it, but space exploration was always such a national endeavor, and now you see companies like SpaceX and all the others coming in, and whether that will set up a more nationalistic view again. I don't know.
Well, I was thinking about this recently and looking at the Wright brothers in 1903. Really, they flew their airplane. They'd been flying gliders for years, but finally they flew their airplane because they could build an engine that was light enough that they could stick it on the plane and it would work. Within 15 years was World War I, and look at the airplanes that they had in World War I. And after World War I, so that was an impetus is obviously war for developing technology. But not long after that, people were flying commercially. And so the acceleration of something like air flight was exponential once you could make money off it. And so now with the upcoming potential, the Virgin Galactic and the Blue Origin and the SpaceX and all of these different companies, which ultimately will have the space tourism. Obviously you've got to have a lot of money to fly in space. But face it, if you wanted to go to Antarctica, one of the first tourists to go to Antarctica in the mid-1900s, you had to spend $100,000 to go down there. Still, it's expensive if you want to go down to Antarctica. So it could only improve as more and more of these tourist flights, once they start, happen. and it may be an opportunity to develop, the technology and get the price per flight down. And maybe this is a way that Canadian industry can get involved. I don't know.
Interesting. So we have a question from Eric, who mentioned the Canadian government was joining the space station program in '85 and noted that the government changed. Was there a risk to the Canadian space program when the Canadian government changed? I'm trying to remember how it changed in '85. It's a little fuzzy in my memory. But was there sort of a political lean to whether or not to do that?
I do remember that the vote to participate in the space station, I think it was during the Chrétien government, and I think it nearly lost. I think it won by like one vote or something like that. If I'm again, please Google and confirm.
Actually, Eric seems to have clarified. Has there been a risk to the Canadian space program when governments have shifted over the years?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I misstated that. Thanks, Eric, for the clarification.
Okay. I think one of the major problems, especially in the States, and possibly Canada as well. Although, whenever there's an election, the last thing that comes up is what are the Liberals or what are the Conservatives going to do about space exploration?
Yeah.
But let's face it, if you look at the U.S. space program, and again, it's very important for us because what they do, affects us. The space program in the States over the last 20 years has been in disarray.
Mm-hmm.
In 2004, President Bush said we are going back to the moon, and we're going to get there by 2015. And then it said, well, maybe by 2019. And if that had continued, we'd be on the moon right now. And then after Bush comes the Obama administration, and they say, no, we're not going to do that. And we're going to cancel the Constellation program, or we're going to just do this, and we're going to stop cancel the space station. So a good space program can't be defined or planned over an 8-year period. I would rather look at something that says, okay, we're going to get to the moon and get to Mars, and here's our 30-year plan, and here are all the different pieces that are affordable, and here's the timeline, and this blah, blah, blah. And that to me can make sense, and not just sort of, switch modes or switch cars after each 8 years. Right. But the problem with that is that no one, we are all interested in space and going to the moon and going to Mars and all that. Not everyone cares. And it's unlike the Apollo days when this was new. Mm-hmm. And, there was the Kennedy, decision to go to the moon by the end of the decade. And no one had really defined whether that was at the end of 69 or the end of 70, but I think everyone assumed it was the end of 69. Even Kennedy's plan was having trouble the month that he was assassinated. And it was really his assassination that sort of kick-started the program again within Congress and say, okay, we will complete this assassinated president's goal of going to the moon. But a lot of people in Congress after Apollo 11 wanted to say, great, that's it. We did it. That's all they wanted to do. That was the goal, and they had completed it. And the scientists were going, oh, no, wait, we have another 10 missions. We want to go and do some exploration and explore. But so, if there isn't the political drive, it seems, then there isn't the incentive to spend a lot of money. I mean, the current space program has benefits, and there are a lot of spin-offs that benefit us here on the Earth. But a big multi-trillion-dollar program to go to Mars, I don't know if it's going to get off the launch pad anytime soon. And that's a big problem with governments that change. Like, what will the Biden government do with space? Trump just wanted to get to the moon by 2024 just because he could be in office, hopefully. He wanted to be in office by then, or still. But now what will Biden do? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I remember visiting Cape Canaveral shortly after a governmental change in the U.S. And I think here, I mean, we have to a lesser extent, we're obviously carried by the tide of what happens down there, but it's quite interesting to see. Winta had an interesting comment to basically corroborating what you were saying, that the privatization of space exploration and travel comes with a cost, but it can speed up the advances, and it might allow for some Canadian contributions that would have been more difficult if it had to go through government approvals. So I think that was an interesting thing. I'm going to take a real step back, because you and I have known each other for, as I said, longer than I will mention. Was it the Apollo program and the moon landing and all that, like, that really sparked your interest in space, or what was it? Can you think back to what really got you to spend your life kind of doing this as a hobby and work and all that?
Yeah, no, it was the summer of '69. I mean, I remember watching Apollo 8, Christmas '68, but not glued to the TV. But by the summer of '69, and again, I tell people, there wasn't internet, so you had to look at a newspaper or get a Life magazine or watch TV, and I had the scrapbooks and I had the plastic models and all that stuff. And I do remember, like, the anniversary of Apollo 12 just ended a couple of days ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it was in grade 7 then. I remember standing up during current affairs and explaining the Apollo 12 mission. And the teacher nearly fell over. Like, how does this kid know all this? And so I was, that really got me going, space exploration wise. And then it was a solar eclipse the next year that got me into astronomy. So
that's.
But now you know how old I am and all that.
Well, that's all right. No, I can't do that kind of math. I'm just kidding. Just curious if there's anybody who's watching along, if you were also inspired by Apollo. I mean, I have to say, I was not around during the '69 landing, but I had that National Geographic growing up with the maps and the pullouts and all that stuff. And it's one of my earliest memories to look through that.
It's interesting. I've met a lot of people that worked on the lunar module, like Tom Kelly and a lot of these people. And these guys at Grumman, they built aircraft, which landed on aircraft carriers. That's what Grumman did. And so when Sputnik came along, they suddenly said, "This is cool, and we want to get into this." And Grumman actually, put in they built an orbiting astronomical satellite and all this other stuff, and ultimately put the bid in for the lunar module. So Sputnik had a way of inspiring a lot of these people. Then you've got the Apollo program. And then you look at people who are working on Shuttle, and you ask them, what inspired you to work on Shuttle? The Apollo program. Mm-hmm. And now you look at people who are in flight control now, controlling the space station and other things. What got you interested in space? Growing up watching the shuttle missions. So there is this inspiration as you go along.
Yeah,
that continues to fuel the next generation.
And are you at all concerned that this has been maybe diminished in the last few years, the lack of a shuttle program, and just, we haven't had a shuttle launch since, I'm not going to be able to pull the number out of my head, but we haven't had one in a while. We were lucky to have Commander Hadfield in the space station, and that, my children were certainly inspired by watching him. But do you think it's a bit of a problem? I mean, the ISS is a really interesting thing, but have we got to have the next big thing, the next big shiny thing to inspire people again, or?
Well, that's a problem I have, is that, during the early days, the Gemini and Apollo and everything, there was always the big first on every mission. So now here we've got, I even forget what expedition we have up on the space station right now, 60 some odd or whatever. So it really is like, no one is like the space station is an international research laboratory. Name another research laboratory, international research laboratory, maybe the Collider or something like that. But no one is sort of watching, with bated breath what's going on there. So research is neat. I wouldn't say it's exciting. But the thing is I don't think you can get into the habit of needing a bright, shiny thing just to get your programs run.
Yeah.
So we've got to come up with a reason to go to the moon, and not just because it's there. And, well, we've already done it. Why do you want to go? Well, because I'll get back to you on that.
Do you think maybe that's a good thing for Canadians to think about too? Because our contributions have been, in many ways, as supporting contributions, but they are all fascinating in their way. Like there's a lot of really fascinating things that we've done, like having the legs on the lunar lander, but not the feet. Like we were almost the first things to touch the surface.
I think we can come up with the ideas. I mean, the idea of just sending some little rovers to the moon that, you can actually control yourself, or, what an inspiration for kids, that kind of thing.
For sure.
Because, the computer technology and the miniaturization, and, that is a lot easier now than it was back then. The story is that the computer capability in your cell phone is some 100,000 times better than the lunar module had in its computer. I mean, it was very, very efficient. It didn't have to do a lot. It did it well. But, computers were so new back then. They literally had to take a computer that fit in this room and stick it into a small briefcase, which they did.
Yeah.
There's so many aspects of Apollo that are amazing. But they had a goal. They had this, there it was staring at them every night. And that's kind of what we need. I'm wondering if, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, I'm wondering if, you look at the Chinese, China's space program. They have said for the longest time, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. In the next day or two, they're landing a spacecraft on the moon. They're bringing the sample back. They've had space stations. They've had man and woman taikonauts. Their program is to go to the moon. It's just, there it is. We're going to go to the moon. We're not going to have any new administrations that's going to mess that up. We're just going to go do that. And when that starts getting serious, I'm wondering how everyone else is going to react. These Chinese taikonauts, are they going to go to one of the Apollo landings and start kicking dust on Neil Armstrong's, empty lunch bag or something like that? But who knows, right? But the thing is, at that point in time, will there be an incentive to, let's go? I mean, the challenge is on again, right? The competition.
Or hopefully the cooperation. I'm that person.
Well,
collaborate.
It would be great. It would be great.
It would. I very Star Trek view of the future for me, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just reading the other day that one of the things that Kennedy was doing, just literally days before he was killed, was putting together a proposal to the Soviets to go to the moon jointly.
Ah, wow. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Well, I just want to look at the comments. People have been commenting. Mike says, watching the moon landing started me on my career. And Mike is a very, very accomplished astronomer. So that's interesting. Vinta says that it was watching the Columbia disaster of 2003. And Vinta, for me, it was the Challenger disaster. That was wasn't the first thing I was aware of, but I remember watching it in absolute horror and seeing the perils of space travel. Then Michael says he remembers winning a public speaking contest in grade school, and his subject was John Glenn, which is amazing. What an amazing person. And Richard says the moon landing in National Geographic magazine started him off. And Roland says that he remembered Apollo 11 and being allowed to stay up late, which is always the great excuse to get into astronomy and space. If we have anybody here who's watching who's a little bit younger, kids, it's great because you get to stay up late and you have a good excuse because you're doing science. And Henry just asks, is the substantial institutional motivation for getting involved as solving problems? So I think that's an interesting question to maybe finish out with. Solving problems and grand challenges. Is that what we're doing? Or are we just having a little fun and playing in the moon dust?
Quite often when you ask this question to an astronaut, they talk about just human beings and the fact that we've always been explorers. And I agree with that. We've always been, as soon as we could build a bigger something or a better something to discover what's on the other side, we do it. And, I often pick up this astronomy textbook that I have from the 1800s and look at what we knew back then and look at what we know now. And I go, and then, imagine what was known 100 years before that and 100 years before that.
Mm-hmm.
We're always trying to learn more about the universe and always wanting to go there. And, this is a great discussion if we could get everybody on, sitting by a lake in a non-light polluted about nighttime, and then you begin to look up and go, yeah, I wonder what is out there. And we can send robots and learn a lot from them, but ideally, I think we want to send people at some point. The question is how soon, how fast, how expensive. And I just don't have the answer to that. Things have slowed down so much. I mean, you talk about the last shuttle mission being in July 2011. So that's over 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, from the time that Kennedy said, let's go to the moon landing, it was 8 years. So we're doing a lot of sort of wondering what we're going to do and when.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I like Michelle has a comment here that she was not exposed. Michelle was not exposed to any launches, and what inspired Michelle was an increased communications and the benefit of exploration and research. So increased communication about the benefit of exploration and research. So not shiny firsts, but that benefit of exploration, the benefit of just basic research is why we need space programs. And I think that that's a really, really good place.
Oh, it is. And actually that will be something we will learn on December 10th during the next talk. Because, MDA and other space companies, research companies, technology companies in Canada are doing those things. And there's just not an easy mechanism for the average person to hear about what great benefits they have from space exploration. You talk about the millions and the $300 million or the millions of dollars that are spent in space exploration, but all that money is spent on the ground, paying experienced and technical people to do these things and come up with innovative ways to do things better. Mm-hmm. And so there's a great benefit there. I look forward to the next talk.
Absolutely. Well, given that it's just past 8:30, I think we're going to begin to wrap up here. So, Randy, thank you very, very much for lending your time tonight. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, and I think everybody who was listening along appreciated what you had to say. So I'm going to take you off screen here and just wrap up a little bit so you can relax now. Just as Randy mentioned, this is the first part of a two-part series, Canada and the Final Frontier. We were looking back tonight. On December 10th, we're going to be looking forward. We're going to put a little panel together of people to talk about Canada's future plans for space. And if you would like to get notification of exactly how that's going to happen, although I imagine it's going to be on our new Space Place Canada YouTube channel, as tonight's was, but you can join our mailing list, which you can see in the chat. I put a little Google form there where you can go in and add your name and email address and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in our project. We also have a note to please subscribe to the YouTube channel. That way you'll get notifications whenever we post anything, which will probably not be again until December 10th, although you never know. Also, you can find out information about what we're up to on our website, again, spaceplacecanada.ca, and our donate to get your wonderful gift prizes for our donations. Remember, $30 for a mask or a music download card, $50 for a book, $100 for all three, and that will be valid. I believe we decided to keep that going through the weekend. So if you can do that, mention you were at this event, then we will send you that gift. So thank you very, very much for joining us tonight for our inaugural event. I know we had a tiny few little technical hiccups, but I hope they were not too difficult to overcome. And we do hope that you'll stay in touch with us and that we will see you all again soon. Thanks so much for joining us. Good night.